I'm Maya Thompson, and 3 weeks ago, my sister Jessica looked me straight in the eye and told me not to come to her bachelorette party. She said it would be better for everyone if I just stayed home in Austin and sent my regrets. What she didn't know was that her fiancé Ryan had been texting me for months, pouring his heart out about feelings he couldn't shake. What nobody expected was him showing up at my apartment the night of her party, confessing that he'd been in love with me since college and begging me to stop his wedding before it was too late. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the suburbs of Lakewood, Colorado, the Thompson household operated like a well-oiled machine built around success, image, and family legacy. My father Robert owned Thompson Insurance Services, a thriving business he'd built from nothing over 25 years. My mother Linda had carved out her own empire in real estate, specializing in luxury homes for Denver's elite. Together they formed this power couple that everyone in our neighborhood admired and envied. Their dream was simple: build a family business dynasty that would span generations. Thompson Real Estate and Insurance would be the foundation, with both daughters stepping into predetermined roles that would expand their influence and secure the family's financial future. It was a beautiful plan on paper, carefully orchestrated and executed with the precision of a military operation. My sister Jessica, 2 years younger than me, embraced this vision from childhood. While other kids played with toys, Jess was accompanying mom to open houses, learning about square footage and market values before she could properly spell either word. By high school, she was already handling client calls and helping dad organize insurance policies. She had this natural gift for making people feel comfortable while simultaneously convincing them they needed whatever our parents were selling. Jessica was everything our parents had hoped for in a daughter. She was polished, professional, and possessed an intuitive understanding of business that made both mom and dad beam with pride. She graduated from the University of Colorado with a business degree, immediately joined the family company, and within 2 years had increased their client base by 30%. She was the golden child who never questioned the path laid out for her, never rebelled against family expectations, and never caused our parents a sleepless night. I was the complication they hadn't planned for. While Jessica was learning about profit margins and client relations, I was hiding in my bedroom sketching elaborate fantasy worlds and designing imaginary book covers. While she was networking at Chamber of Commerce events, I was teaching myself Photoshop and spending hours perfecting digital art pieces that served no practical business purpose. My parents watched this development with growing concern, hoping it was a phase I'd outgrow once I understood the real world better. The first major crack in their family business plan appeared during my junior year of high school when I announced I wanted to study graphic design instead of business. The dinner table conversation that followed became legendary in our family history, not because of the volume of the argument, but because of the stunned silence that followed my declaration. My father set down his fork and stared at me as if I'd announced my intention to join a traveling circus. My mother's perfectly composed expression cracked just enough to reveal genuine bewilderment. Jessica, ever the peacekeeper, tried to find middle ground by suggesting I could use graphic design skills for the family business marketing materials. But I wasn't interested in compromise. I had discovered something that made me feel alive in a way that insurance policies and property listings never could. When I was designing, time disappeared. When I was creating visual solutions to complex problems, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The idea of spending my life in an office handling clients who needed coverage for their boats and vacation homes made me feel claustrophobic. The arguments continued throughout my senior year, with my parents deploying every strategy they could think of to redirect my ambitions. They brought in family friends who worked in creative fields to explain how unstable and financially unrewarding artistic careers could be. They showed me spreadsheets demonstrating the earning potential of joining the family business versus pursuing design. They even offered to pay for business school at any university I chose, with the promise of immediate partnership in the company upon graduation. None of it worked because I had already glimpsed what passion felt like, and I couldn't pretend I didn't know the difference. College at UC Boulder became my escape hatch. Surrounded by other students who were pursuing dreams their families didn't understand, I finally felt normal. My graphic design professors recognized talent I didn't even know I possessed and pushed me to develop skills that went far beyond what I'd taught myself in high school. For the first time in my life, I was around adults who valued creativity and original thinking over financial security and family expectations. It was during my sophomore year that Jessica started dating Ryan Mitchell, a business major who seemed like the perfect addition to our family's grand plan. Ryan was handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way that made mothers swoon and fathers nod approvingly. He came from a solid middle-class family where his father ran a successful contracting business and his mother worked as a nurse at Denver General. He was respectful, ambitious, and showed genuine interest in learning about our family's business operations. More importantly, Ryan adored Jessica. He brought her flowers for no reason, remembered details about her day that even I sometimes forgot, and looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in any room. Their relationship had this fairy tale quality that made everyone around them believe in true love and happy endings. I liked Ryan immediately, but not in any way that concerned me at the time. He was easy to talk to, genuinely interested in my design work, and never made me feel like the weird artistic sister who didn't fit the family mold. When he and Jessica would visit me at college, he'd spend time looking at my portfolio and asking intelligent questions about my creative process. He was one of the few people in my life who seemed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
To understand that graphic design was more than just making things look pretty. During those college visits, the three of us would hang out like old friends. We'd explore Boulder together, try new restaurants, and spend hours talking about everything from career dreams to philosophical questions about what made life meaningful. Ryan had this way of drawing people out, making them feel heard and understood. I appreciated having someone in Jessica's life who could bridge the gap between her business-focused world and my creative pursuits. But even then, I noticed things that probably should have concerned me more than they did. Ryan would ask detailed questions about my projects and remember specific details about my goals long after our conversations ended. He'd text me independently of Jessica sometimes, sharing articles about design trends or asking for my opinion on marketing materials for his part-time job. He seemed genuinely invested in my success in a way that felt supportive rather than inappropriate. The real turning point came during my senior year when I landed an internship with a prestigious design firm in Austin, Texas. The opportunity was everything I'd dreamed of, working with established professionals, handling real client projects, and getting paid to do work I loved. The internship came with the possibility of a full-time position after graduation, which would mean staying in Austin and building my career far from Colorado. My parents' reaction was predictably negative. They saw the internship as the final nail in the coffin of their family business dreams and made no effort to hide their disappointment. My father actually suggested I turn down the opportunity and spend the summer learning advanced aspects of the insurance business instead. My mother worried aloud about me being so far from family, living in a city where I didn't know anyone. Jessica's response surprised me with its intensity. She was furious in a way I'd never seen before, accusing me of abandoning the family and being selfish about my own desires without considering how my choices affected everyone else. She said I was throwing away everything our parents had worked to build and that my pursuit of an artistic career was immature and irresponsible. The argument escalated until she finally said something that changed our relationship forever. "You've always thought you were too good for this family, Maya. Now you're just proving it." The words stung because there was a grain of truth buried in the accusation. I did feel different from my family, like I was constantly trying to fit into a space that wasn't designed for someone like me. But I had never thought I was too good for them. I just knew I needed to find my own path, even if they couldn't understand or support it. I took the internship and moved to Austin immediately after graduation. The design firm offered me a full-time position before my internship ended, and I accepted without consulting my family. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions based purely on what felt right for me, without considering how those choices would be received at home. The distance between Austin and Denver wasn't just geographical. Phone calls with my parents became stilted and infrequent, filled with updates about Jessica's achievements at the company and polite inquiries about my job that never quite masked their underlying disapproval. Jessica and I maintained contact, but our conversations felt careful and surface level, as if we were both avoiding topics that might lead to conflict. Ryan, surprisingly, became the family member who stayed most connected with me during those early months in Austin. He would text occasionally to check how I was adjusting to city life, share photos from family gatherings I was missing, and ask about projects I was working on. His messages felt like a lifeline to home, especially during those first few months when I was questioning whether I'd made the right choice by moving so far away. Through Ryan's updates, I learned that Jessica was thriving in the family business. She had taken over most of the real estate operations and was developing innovative marketing strategies that were attracting high-end clients. Our parents were prouder of her than ever, and she seemed to be living exactly the life she'd always wanted. I was genuinely happy for her success, even though it highlighted how different our paths had become. Jessica had found fulfillment within the framework our parents had created, while I was building something entirely new in a different state. There was room for both approaches to be valid, but our family seemed to view my choice as a rejection of everything they valued. About a year after I moved to Austin, Ryan called to tell me he was planning to propose to Jessica. He wanted my advice about rings and proposal ideas, which felt both flattering and slightly odd. I helped him design a custom engagement that incorporated elements meaningful to their relationship, and he seemed genuinely grateful for my creative input. When Jessica called to announce their engagement, she sounded happier than I'd heard her in months. She bubbled over with details about the proposal, the ring, and their initial wedding plans. For the first time since I'd moved away, our conversation felt natural and unguarded. I was thrilled for her happiness and relieved that my relationship with my sister might be healing. The engagement seemed to soften my parents' attitude toward me as well. My mother called to discuss wedding plans and actually asked about my work in Austin with what sounded like genuine interest. My father mentioned that he'd been telling clients about his daughter who was building a successful design career in Texas. It felt like maybe my family was finally ready to accept my choices, even if they didn't completely understand them. But as the wedding planning progressed over the following year, I started noticing subtle changes in Ryan's communication with me. His texts became more frequent and more personal. He would share frustrations about work, ask for advice about relationship challenges, and sometimes send messages late at night when he was clearly in a reflective mood. The content of his messages never crossed obvious lines, but the frequency and intimacy of our communication started feeling inappropriate. He would tell me things about his relationship with Jessica that seemed too private to share with her sister. He would ask my opinion about decisions that should have been between him and his fiancé. Most concerning, he seemed to value my perspective on his life in a way that felt more significant than a normal friendship with his future sister-in-law. I tried to maintain appropriate boundaries while not making the situation awkward for Jessica's sake. I would respond to his messages politely but briefly, redirect personal questions back to Jessica, and avoid engaging with anything that felt like emotional intimacy. But Ryan seemed oblivious to my attempts to create distance, continuing to treat me like his closest confidant. The situation became more complicated 6 months before the wedding when Ryan started expressing doubts about his career path. He had been working at a financial services firm since college, but was feeling unfulfilled and questioning whether he wanted to spend his life managing other people's money. In anyone else, this might have been a normal quarter-life crisis. But Ryan's timing was problematic, coming just as he was about to marry into a family business that would expect him to demonstrate enthusiasm for financial success and professional advancement. He started asking me detailed questions about how I had found the courage to pursue my passion despite family pressure. He wanted to know about the emotional process of choosing an unconventional path, how I had dealt with disappointing people I loved, and whether I ever regretted my decision to prioritize personal fulfillment over family expectations. These conversations felt dangerous because they revealed that Ryan was struggling with the same fundamental conflict that had driven me away from Colorado. He was beginning to question whether the life he was building with Jessica was authentic to who he really was, or whether he was simply following a script that other people had written for him. I tried to encourage him to have these conversations with Jessica instead of me, but he insisted that she wouldn't understand his doubts. He said Jessica was so perfectly suited for the life they were planning that she couldn't relate to feeling torn between love and personal authenticity. He worried that expressing his career doubts would make her question their compatibility in ways that might damage their relationship. Part of me understood his dilemma, but another part was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with being his emotional support system for problems that directly involved my sister. I was caught between wanting to help someone I cared about and recognizing that my involvement in his internal struggles was inappropriate and potentially harmful to Jessica. The situation reached a crisis point 3 months before the wedding, when Ryan sent me a long message after midnight, explaining that he had been accepted to a master's program in environmental science at a university in Oregon. The program would allow him to transition into conservation work, something he'd been passionate about since college, but had never seriously pursued. The acceptance was unexpected because he had applied months earlier and forgotten about it, assuming he wouldn't be chosen. Now he had to decide whether to defer his admission for a year or turn down the opportunity entirely to proceed with his current life plan. The timing couldn't have been worse. Jessica had just finalized their honeymoon reservations, sent out wedding invitations, and was deep into planning the details of their shared future in Colorado. Ryan asked for my advice about how to handle the situation, but I knew there was no good answer I could give him. This was exactly the kind of major life decision that needed to be discussed openly and honestly with his fiancé, regardless of how difficult the conversation might be. I told him as much, urging him to talk to Jessica immediately and work through the decision together. But Ryan wasn't ready for that conversation. He said he needed time to figure out what he really wanted before involving Jessica in his uncertainty. He asked if we could meet in person to talk through his options, suggesting he could drive to Austin for a weekend. The request crossed every boundary I'd been trying to maintain, and I declined firmly, explaining that this level of personal consultation wasn't appropriate given our relationships. That's when Ryan made the confession that changed everything. He said he had been questioning more than just his career path. He admitted that our conversations over the past 2 years had made him realize he felt more intellectually and emotionally connected to me than he did to Jessica. He said he loved Jessica but wasn't sure he was in love with her anymore, and he couldn't stop thinking about what his life might look like if he had pursued someone who shared his deeper interests and values. The message was devastating to read because it confirmed fears I had been trying to ignore for months. Ryan's excessive communication with me hadn't been innocent friendship or normal pre-wedding anxiety. He had been emotionally investing in a relationship with me while planning to marry my sister. Even worse, he was now suggesting that his feelings for me were influencing his doubts about Jessica. I didn't respond to his confession immediately because I needed time to process the implications and figure out how to handle the situation responsibly. This wasn't just about Ryan's feelings or my discomfort anymore. Jessica's happiness and our family's stability were at stake, and I had somehow become an unwitting participant in a situation that could destroy both. After 3 days of agonizing over the right response, I sent Ryan a clear message explaining that his confession was inappropriate and unfair to Jessica. I told him that whatever feelings he thought he had for me were probably a projection of his anxiety about commitment and his uncertainty about his future. I urged him to seek counseling to work through his doubts, and to either commit fully to Jessica or end their engagement before the wedding. Most importantly, I told him that our communication needed to stop immediately. I explained that I couldn't continue any relationship with him that felt disloyal to Jessica, and that his confession had made it impossible for me to maintain normal family interactions without feeling complicit in his deception. Ryan's response was to apologize profusely, and promise that he would work through his feelings and recommit to Jessica. He said he understood my position and would respect my request for no contact. For about 2 weeks I believed the situation had been resolved, and that Ryan would find a way to move forward with his engagement in a healthy way. But then Jessica called with news that made my stomach drop. She said Ryan had become distant and moody, canceling social plans and spending hours alone without explanation. She was worried he might be having second thoughts about the wedding, and asked if I had noticed anything unusual during our family communications. I found myself in an impossible position. I couldn't tell Jessica about Ryan's confession without revealing that I had been having inappropriate communication with her fiancé for months. I couldn't explain his behavior without betraying his confidence about his career doubts and personal struggles. But I also couldn't pretend everything was normal when I knew her fiancé was questioning their entire relationship. I tried to give Jessica generic advice about pre-wedding anxiety, and suggested she encourage Ryan to talk openly about any concerns he might have. I emphasized that it was normal for people to feel overwhelmed before major life changes, and that honest communication was the best way to work through those feelings. But Jessica seemed to interpret my response as dismissive. She said I didn't understand the situation because I hadn't been around to see how dramatically Ryan's behavior had changed. She accused me of being too absorbed in my own life in Austin to care about what was happening with my family in Colorado. The accusation hurt because it contained enough truth to sting. I had been emotionally distant from my family for 3 years, partly by choice and partly because of the ongoing tension about my career decisions. From Jessica's perspective, I was the sister who had abandoned the family and now couldn't be bothered to provide support during a difficult time. What she didn't know was that I was desperate to help but trapped by knowledge I couldn't share without making the situation exponentially worse. The final crisis began 2 weeks before the wedding, when Jessica called to uninvite me from her bachelorette party. She said the celebration was going to be intimate, just her closest friends, and that my presence might make things awkward since I didn't really know most of the people who would be there. The excuse was transparent and hurtful. Jessica and I might have grown apart over the years, but I was still her sister, and traditionally the maid of honor's sister would be included in pre-wedding celebrations regardless of social dynamics. She was clearly punishing me for my perceived lack of support during her crisis with Ryan, but she was also unknowingly protecting herself from a situation that would have been emotionally devastating for me. How could I celebrate Jessica's upcoming marriage when I knew her fiancé had confessed feelings for me just months earlier? How could I participate in toasts and well wishes when I was carrying a secret that could destroy everything she thought she knew about her relationship? I accepted the disinvitation with as much grace as I could manage, telling Jessica I understood and hoped she had a wonderful time with her friends. Privately, I was relieved to avoid a situation that would have been torture for everyone involved, even though Jessica's rejection stung deeply. But then the night Jessica and her friends were celebrating in Vail, Ryan showed up at my apartment in Austin. The knock on my apartment door came at 9:47 p.m. on a Saturday night, just as I was settling in with a cup of tea and a design project I'd been putting off all week. Austin was experiencing one of its famous thunderstorms, and the rain was drumming against my windows with an intensity that made my cozy living room feel like a refuge from the chaos outside. I wasn't expecting anyone. My social life in Austin consisted mainly of work colleagues and a few neighbors I'd befriended over the past 3 years, none of whom would show up unannounced on a weekend evening. When I looked through the peephole and saw Ryan standing in the hallway, soaked from the rain and looking like he'd been wrestling with demons, my heart stopped. He looked terrible. His usually perfectly styled hair was plastered to his head, his clothes were wrinkled and damp, and his eyes had the haunted quality of someone who hadn't slept in days. But it was his expression that truly alarmed me. This wasn't the composed, confident man who had been dating my sister for 3 years. This was someone who looked like he was drowning and had come to my door as his last hope for salvation. My first instinct was to pretend I wasn't home. After our last conversation 2 months ago, when I told him our communication needed to stop, we hadn't exchanged a single message. I had assumed he was working through his doubts with Jessica and preparing for their wedding like a normal groom should be doing. Seeing him at my door now, clearly in crisis, was my worst nightmare coming to life, but I couldn't ignore him. Not when he looked so desperate, and not when I knew Jessica was 3 states away celebrating her bachelorette party, completely unaware that her fiancé was having some kind of breakdown. I opened the door just wide enough to speak to him without inviting him inside. Ryan's relief at seeing me was palpable and deeply unsettling. He said my name like it was a prayer, and I could see his shoulders relax slightly for the first time since I'd spotted him through the peephole. The intensity of his reaction confirmed my worst fears about why he was standing outside my apartment at nearly 10 o'clock on a stormy Saturday night. I asked him what he was doing in Austin, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. He explained that he had driven straight from Denver, a 12-hour journey he'd apparently made without stopping except for gas. He said he couldn't go through with the wedding without talking to me first, without making me understand how he felt, without giving us a chance to explore what might be possible between us. The words hit me like physical blows. This was exactly what I had been afraid of when I'd cut off our communication. Ryan hadn't worked through his feelings or recommitted to Jessica. Instead, he'd spent 2 months obsessing over our conversations and building up a fantasy about what our relationship could become. Now he was at my door, less than 2 weeks before his wedding, ready to blow up both our lives for something that existed only in his imagination. I told him he needed to leave immediately and go back to Denver. I explained that showing up at my apartment was inappropriate and unfair to Jessica, who was probably trying to call him from her bachelorette party and wondering where he was. I reminded him that we had already discussed this situation and agreed that his feelings were misplaced and destructive. But Ryan wasn't listening to reason. He was operating from a place of pure emotion, convinced that our connection was real and significant enough to justify disrupting everyone's lives. He said he had spent weeks trying to convince himself that he could marry Jessica and be happy, but every time he imagined their future together, he felt like he was suffocating. He said the only time he felt truly alive was when he was talking to me, when he was sharing his thoughts and dreams with someone who actually understood him. The romantic language he was using made me incredibly uncomfortable, partly because it revealed how deeply he had been fantasizing about me, and partly because there was a grain of truth in what he was saying that I didn't want to acknowledge. Our conversations over the past 2 years had been intellectually stimulating and emotionally satisfying in ways that surprised me. We did understand each other in ways that felt rare and valuable. But understanding someone and being compatible with them are 2 entirely different things. What Ryan was describing sounded like the classic mistake of confusing emotional intimacy with romantic love. He had been sharing parts of himself with me that he couldn't share with Jessica, and he had interpreted that connection as evidence that we were meant to be together. The reality was that our communication had been inappropriate precisely because it had created false intimacy. We had been having the kinds of deep personal conversations that should happen between romantic partners, not between future in-laws. Ryan had been using me as an emotional outlet for feelings he should have been processing with Jessica or a therapist. Now he was confusing the relief of being understood with the belief that we had a destined connection. I tried to explain this to him, but he was beyond rational discussion. He kept insisting that what we had was special, that he had never felt so seen and understood by another person, that
Marrying Jessica while feeling this way about me would be a betrayal of everyone involved. He said he couldn't live a lie, couldn't commit to a marriage that felt wrong when he knew there was something real and authentic waiting for him if he had the courage to pursue it. The most frustrating part of his argument was that he was using my own journey of choosing authenticity over family expectations as justification for his behavior. He kept referencing our conversations about following your passion despite disapproval, about having the courage to disappoint people in service of being true to yourself. He was twisting my story about pursuing graphic design into permission for him to abandon his fiancée 2 weeks before their wedding. Standing in my doorway, watching this man I had once considered a friend completely spiral out of control, I realized how naive I had been about the situation. I had thought I was being helpful by listening to his doubts and offering perspective about choosing unconventional paths. I had told myself that our communication was innocent because we weren't physically involved, and because I wasn't encouraging his feelings for me. But I had been encouraging him, just not in the way I intended. By being a sympathetic ear for his dissatisfaction with his conventional life, by sharing my own story of breaking free from family expectations, by engaging in deep conversations about authenticity and passion, I had inadvertently become a symbol of the alternative life he thought he wanted. Ryan wasn't really in love with me, he was in love with what I represented: freedom from expectations, permission to follow his dreams, validation for his unconventional thoughts and feelings. I had become a fantasy figure in his mind, someone who could save him from a life that felt increasingly wrong to him. The problem was that real relationships aren't built on what people represent to each other. They're built on daily compatibility, shared values, mutual respect, and genuine affection that develops over time and through shared experiences. Ryan and I had never had a real relationship. We'd had an emotional affair disguised as friendship, where he had projected his fantasies onto me, while I had unknowingly enabled his avoidance of real communication with Jessica. I told him all of this as gently but firmly as I could. I explained that his feelings for me were a symptom of his uncertainty about his life choices, not evidence that we belonged together. I urged him to return to Denver immediately and have an honest conversation with Jessica about his doubts, his career concerns, and his fear about their future together. Most importantly, I told him that even if his feelings for me were genuine, I didn't share them. I cared about him as a friend and future family member, but I had never seen him as anything more than my sister's boyfriend. Whatever connection he felt we had shared was one-sided and based on a misinterpretation of conversations that should never have happened in the first place. Ryan's reaction to my rejection was heartbreaking to witness. The hope and determination that had carried him through 12 hours of driving seemed to crumble before my eyes. He started crying, not the controlled tears of disappointment but the raw, desperate sobs of someone whose last hope had just been destroyed. He said he couldn't go back to Denver and pretend everything was fine. He couldn't marry Jessica while feeling like he was settling for a life that would never truly satisfy him. He said he would rather call off the wedding and deal with the consequences than commit to a marriage that felt like a lie from the beginning. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to find some way to ease his pain and help him figure out a path forward. But a larger part of me was beginning to feel angry about the position he had put me in. His crisis was affecting not just him and Jessica, but me and my entire family. His inability to communicate honestly with his fiancée had created a situation where I was now complicit in deception that could destroy my relationship with my sister forever. I had spent 3 years rebuilding my relationship with my family after the tension around my career choices. Things with Jessica had finally started to feel normal again, and my parents had begun to accept and even take pride in my success in Austin. Now Ryan's emotional crisis threatened to undo all of that progress by putting me in an impossible situation with no good outcomes. If I told Jessica about Ryan's visit and his confession, she would be devastated just weeks before their wedding. She would also want to know why he had come to me, which would require explaining our months of inappropriate communication. Jessica would rightfully feel betrayed by both of us, and our family relationships would be permanently damaged. If I didn't tell Jessica and Ryan went through with the wedding, I would spend the rest of my life knowing that my sister had married someone who had confessed feelings for me 2 weeks before their ceremony. Every family gathering, every holiday, every celebration would be tainted by that knowledge. I would never be able to have a normal relationship with either of them again. If Ryan called off the wedding without explanation, Jessica would be humiliated and heartbroken, and my family would rally around her while wondering what had gone wrong. They might eventually discover that Ryan had come to Austin, which would raise questions about my role in the situation that I couldn't answer honestly without revealing everything. Every possible outcome felt like a disaster, and I resented Ryan for creating this mess through his inability to handle his pre-wedding anxiety like an adult. Instead of talking to Jessica about his doubts, getting counseling, or taking time to figure out what he really wanted before proposing, he had used me as an emotional escape hatch, and then convinced himself that our connection was meaningful enough to justify destroying multiple lives. I told Ryan that he needed to make a decision about his future with Jessica based on their relationship, not on fantasies about alternative lives with other people. I said that if he truly couldn't commit to marrying her, he owed her an honest explanation that didn't involve dragging me into the situation. Most importantly, I told him that regardless of what he decided about the wedding, he needed to leave my apartment immediately and never contact me again. Ryan tried to argue, to convince me to give him a chance to prove that his feelings were real and not just projection. He said he would break up with Jessica that night if I would agree to explore a relationship with him. He offered to move to Austin, to change his entire life to be with me, to prove that he was serious about choosing authenticity over convention. But his offers only reinforced my belief that he was using me as an escape from problems he needed to solve on his own. Real love doesn't require someone to abandon their entire life and move across the country after a single conversation. Real relationships develop gradually through mutual interest and shared experiences, not through dramatic gestures motivated by desperation and fantasy. I refused his offers and repeated my demand that he leave. When he continued to argue, I threatened to call the police if he didn't vacate my property immediately. The threat seemed to finally penetrate his emotional haze, and he realized that his presence was unwelcome and his pursuit was unwanted. As he turned to leave, Ryan made one final plea that revealed just how deeply he had been fantasizing about our potential relationship. He said he had already imagined the life we could build together, how he could support my design career while pursuing his own dreams in environmental science, how we could travel and explore the world together without the constraints of family expectations and traditional timelines. The level of detail in his fantasy was both touching and terrifying. He had clearly spent weeks or months constructing an elaborate alternative reality where we were partners in some grand adventure of authentic living. But fantasies, no matter how detailed and appealing, aren't substitutes for real relationships built on mutual consent and genuine compatibility. After Ryan left, I sat in my living room trying to process what had just happened and figure out what to do next. The storm outside was beginning to calm, but the chaos in my personal life was just getting started. I had approximately 36 hours before Jessica returned from her bachelorette party and started making final preparations for her wedding. In that time, I needed to decide whether to tell her about Ryan's visit, warn her about his doubts, or find some other way to handle a situation that seemed to have no good solutions. The weight of carrying this secret felt crushing. I had never kept anything significant from Jessica, even during the years when our relationship was strained by my career choices and geographic distance. We had always been honest with each other, sometimes brutally so. Now I was sitting on information that could destroy her happiness, and I had no idea how to navigate the ethical implications of my knowledge. Part of me believed that Jessica had a right to know what kind of man she was about to marry. If Ryan was capable of driving 12 hours to confess feelings for her sister 2 weeks before their wedding, what did that say about his character and his commitment to their marriage? If he was having such serious doubts about their relationship that he was willing to blow up both their lives for a fantasy, shouldn't Jessica be aware of that before she legally and emotionally bound herself to him? But another part of me recognized that telling Jessica would cause immediate and irreparable damage to multiple relationships. She would be devastated by Ryan's betrayal, hurt by my months of secret communication with him, and probably unable to trust either of us ever again. The revelation would also destroy the family harmony we had worked so hard to rebuild over the past year. There was also the possibility that Ryan would come to his senses, return to Denver, and find a way to recommit to Jessica without her ever needing to know about his crisis. Maybe his visit to Austin had been the wake-up call he needed to stop fantasizing about alternative lives and start appreciating what he actually had. Maybe confessing his feelings to me, and having them firmly rejected, would help him understand that his doubts about Jessica were really doubts about himself and his readiness for marriage. If that happened, telling Jessica about his visit would be unnecessarily cruel. It would destroy her trust and happiness for no good reason, since Ryan would have already resolved his issues and committed to being a good husband. The knowledge would only hurt her without protecting her from any ongoing threat or deception. But what if Ryan didn't come to his senses? What if he returned to Denver still confused and resentful about having to marry Jessica when he believed he belonged with someone else? What if he went through with the wedding but remained emotionally unavailable and dissatisfied, creating years of marriage problems that Jessica wouldn't understand because she didn't know about his crisis? The more I thought about the situation, the more convinced I became that there were no good choices available to me. Every option involved betraying someone's trust, causing someone pain, or enabling someone's deception. I had been dragged into a situation where being ethical to one person meant being unethical to another, and there was no clear moral path forward. Eventually, exhaustion overtook analysis, and I went to bed without reaching any conclusions about what to do. I hoped that a good night's sleep would provide clarity about how to handle Ryan's confession and protect everyone involved from unnecessary pain. But sleep didn't bring wisdom, only more anxiety about the impossible position I was in. I woke up the next morning feeling like I was trapped in a nightmare where every choice led to disaster, and every decision carried the potential to destroy relationships I cared about deeply. The first thing I did was check my phone for messages from Jessica or other family members. I was terrified that Ryan had done something dramatic after leaving my apartment, like calling Jessica to confess his feelings or announcing that he was calling off the wedding. But there were no crisis messages, just a cheerful photo from Jessica showing her and her friends having drinks at a mountain resort in Vail. Seeing my sister looking so happy and carefree made my stomach clench with guilt and anxiety. She was celebrating what should be one of the most joyous times in her life, completely unaware that her fiancé had spent the previous evening confessing his love for her sister. The contrast between her joy and my knowledge felt almost unbearable. I spent the day trying to distract myself with work and normal Sunday activities, but I couldn't stop thinking about Ryan and Jessica and the wedding that was now less than 2 weeks away. Every time my phone buzzed, I was afraid it would be news that something terrible had happened, that Ryan had made some confession or decision that would reveal the truth about his visit to Austin. But as the day progressed without any crisis messages, I began to hope that maybe Ryan had listened to my advice and was finding a way to work through his doubts constructively. Maybe his night of driving and soul-searching had helped him realize that his feelings for me were really about his fear of commitment and his uncertainty about his future. Maybe he was using Sunday to have honest conversations with Jessica about his concerns and their plans. The hope was fragile and probably naive, but it was the only thing that allowed me to function normally as I waited to see what would happen next. I couldn't control Ryan's choices or predict how the situation would develop, but I could try to prepare myself for whatever came next and figure out how to minimize the damage to everyone involved. What I didn't expect was that Ryan's crisis was just the beginning of a much larger revelation that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my sister, and the life I had built for myself in Austin. Monday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. The Austin sun streamed through my apartment windows, painting everything in golden light that should have felt hopeful, but instead seemed to mock the chaos brewing beneath the surface of my seemingly peaceful life. I had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of Ryan's unexpected visit, searching for clues about what he might do next. My phone remained mercifully quiet throughout the morning, but the silence felt ominous rather than reassuring. I kept imagining worst-case scenarios: Ryan calling off the wedding without explanation, Jessica discovering his absence from Denver and demanding answers, my parents finding out about the crisis and somehow connecting it to me. Every potential outcome seemed designed to maximize pain for everyone involved. I tried to maintain my usual Monday routine, checking emails and starting work on a new branding project for a local restaurant chain. Design work had always been my sanctuary, the one place where I could lose myself completely and forget about external pressures and complications. But even the familiar comfort of creative problem-solving couldn't quiet the anxiety that had taken residence in my chest like a persistent ache. Around 10 in the morning, my phone finally rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and my heart immediately started racing. This was either going to be a normal post-Bachelorette party recap call, or the beginning of the disaster I'd been dreading since Ryan left my apartment. Jessica's voice sounded bright and energetic, slightly hoarse from what had apparently been an epic weekend of celebration in Vail. She launched into an enthusiastic description of spa treatments, mountain hikes, and late-night conversations with her closest friends. The pure joy in her voice was both wonderful to hear and absolutely devastating, given what I knew about her fiancé's mental state. She told me about the resort where they'd stayed, a luxury mountain retreat with stunning views and world-class amenities. Her friends had apparently gone all out to make the weekend special, organizing surprise activities and gift exchanges that had left Jessica feeling overwhelmed with gratitude and love. She described feeling more supported and celebrated than she'd ever experienced, surrounded by women who genuinely cared about her happiness and success. As Jessica shared details about inside jokes from the weekend and funny stories about her friends' romantic advice, I found myself fighting back tears. This should have been one of the happiest times in her life, a perfect weekend celebrating her upcoming marriage to someone she loved and trusted. Instead, her fiancé had spent Saturday night confessing his feelings for her sister and questioning everything about their relationship. The irony was crushing. While Jessica was surrounded by friends telling her how lucky Ryan was to marry her and how perfect they were together, Ryan was driving through the night to Austin, convinced that he belonged with someone else entirely. The disconnect between her experience and reality felt almost surreal. Jessica eventually asked about my weekend, and I struggled to find words that weren't technically lies. I told her I'd worked on some design projects and enjoyed the thunderstorm from the comfort of my apartment, which was true as far as it went. I just omitted the part about her fiancé showing up at my door in crisis mode. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Jessica mentioned that she'd been trying to reach Ryan throughout the weekend without success. She said his phone seemed to be turned off or out of service, which was unusual since he typically responded to her messages within minutes. She was starting to worry that something might be wrong, especially given his strange behavior over the past few weeks. My stomach dropped as I realized the implications of Ryan's communication blackout. If he'd been unreachable since Saturday, Jessica had no idea where he was or what he was doing. She probably assumed he was having a normal weekend with his friends, maybe a low-key bachelor celebration, or just time to himself before the wedding chaos intensified. Jessica asked if I'd heard from Ryan recently, since she knew we occasionally exchanged messages about family events or wedding planning details. The question put me in an impossible position. I couldn't tell her about his visit without revealing everything else, but I also couldn't lie directly about whether I'd seen him. I managed to deflect the question by suggesting that Ryan might be having his own version of pre-wedding reflection time, processing the magnitude of the commitment he was about to make. I said it was normal for people to need space to think before major life changes, and that his temporary communication silence probably wasn't cause for serious concern. Even as I said the words, I knew they were inadequate and potentially harmful. Jessica deserved to know where her fiancé was and what he was going through, especially since his behavior was clearly causing her anxiety. But I couldn't provide that information without destroying multiple relationships and exposing months of inappropriate communication. Jessica seemed partially reassured by my explanation, but I could hear the underlying worry in her voice. She said she'd continue trying to reach Ryan and hoped he'd resurface soon, with a reasonable explanation for his absence. She mentioned that they had a final cake tasting scheduled for Tuesday and several other wedding-related appointments throughout the week that required both of their participation. After we hung up, I sat in my home office staring at my computer screen and feeling like the worst sister in the world. Jessica trusted me enough to share her concerns about Ryan, and I had essentially lied to her face about the situation. She was counting on me for support and honesty, and I was withholding information that directly affected her well-being and future happiness. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the knowledge that telling her the truth would cause immediate and probably irreparable damage. I was trapped between my loyalty to Jessica and my desire to protect her from pain that might be unnecessary if Ryan came to his senses and recommitted to their relationship. Tuesday passed without any contact from Ryan, which both relieved and worried me. The silence suggested that he hadn't done anything dramatically destructive, like calling off the wedding or confessing his crisis to Jessica. But it also meant he was still somewhere processing his feelings and making decisions that could affect all of our lives. I found myself constantly checking my phone for updates from family members, expecting at any moment to receive news that something had gone terribly wrong. The anticipation was exhausting, making it difficult to concentrate on work or maintain any semblance of normal routine. Wednesday afternoon brought a text message that made my blood run cold. Ryan had finally contacted me, sending a simple message that said he was back in Denver and needed to talk to me urgently. He said he'd made a decision about the wedding and wanted me to know before he spoke to Jessica. The message filled me with dread because it suggested that Ryan was planning to involve me in whatever announcement he was about to make. If he was going to call off the wedding, I didn't want to be positioned as someone who had advanced knowledge of his decision. If he was going to confess his feelings for me to Jessica, I absolutely couldn't be seen as complicit in that revelation. I responded immediately, telling Ryan that he couldn't involve me in his decision-making process any further. I said that whatever he chose to do about the wedding needed to be between him and Jessica, and that I wouldn't participate in any conversations about his feelings or his plans. I emphasized that he needed to handle the situation like an adult, without dragging me into the aftermath of his choices. Ryan's response was immediate and alarming. He said he'd decided to go through with the wedding, but only if I agreed to maintain a relationship with him afterward. He wanted assurance that we could continue being friends and confidants, that his marriage to Jessica wouldn't mean the end of our connection. The proposal was so inappropriate and manipulative that I was momentarily speechless. Ryan was essentially asking me to enable his emotional affair with me throughout his marriage to my sister. He wanted to marry Jessica while maintaining the inappropriate intimate friendship that had caused his crisis in the first place. I realized then that Ryan had completely misunderstood both his own feelings and the nature of our relationship. He thought he could have it both ways, the stability and family approval that came with marrying Jessica, plus the emotional intimacy and intellectual connection he believed he shared with me. He didn't understand that his feelings for me were incompatible with a healthy marriage to anyone else. I responded with absolute clarity and firmness. I told Ryan that if he married Jessica, he needed to commit to her completely, which meant ending all inappropriate communication with me. I explained that I wouldn't maintain any relationship with him that felt disloyal to my sister, and that his request was unfair to everyone involved. Most importantly, I told him that if he couldn't marry Jessica, without reservations and without needing emotional support from other women, he shouldn't marry her at all. A good marriage required complete emotional availability and commitment, not the kind of divided loyalty he was proposing. Ryan's final message in our exchange was both pathetic and revealing. He said he didn't think he could be happy in a marriage where he had to give up the one relationship that made him feel truly understood. He accused me of being selfish for refusing to continue our friendship, saying I was condemning him to a life of emotional isolation and unfulfillment. The accusation was so backwards and self-serving that it crystallized my understanding of who Ryan really was. He wasn't a tragic romantic figure torn between two loves. He was an emotionally immature man who wanted to avoid the hard work of building genuine intimacy with his partner by maintaining inappropriate relationships with other women. His threat to be unhappy in his marriage unless I enabled his emotional affair revealed that he had never really committed to Jessica in the first place. He had been using me as an escape from the challenges of building a real relationship, and now he wanted to formalize that arrangement by maintaining our inappropriate connection throughout his marriage. I blocked Ryan's number after sending one final message telling him to get professional help and figure out what he actually wanted from life before making any permanent decisions about marriage. I realized that I couldn't save him from his own poor choices, and that continuing to engage with his crisis was enabling his avoidance of real solutions. The next few days passed in tense silence. I heard nothing from Ryan, but Jessica called twice with updates about wedding preparations and continued concern about her fiancé's strange behavior. She said Ryan had reappeared and claimed he'd been dealing with work stress, but his explanation felt incomplete and unsatisfying. Jessica mentioned that Ryan seemed distant and preoccupied, going through the motions of wedding planning without enthusiasm or genuine engagement. She was beginning to worry that he might be having serious doubts about their marriage, but she didn't know how to address her concerns without seeming needy or paranoid. Listening to my sister's growing anxiety, while knowing the real cause of Ryan's behavior was torture, Jessica was internalizing his emotional distance as a reflection of her own inadequacy, wondering if she'd done something wrong, or if there were problems in their relationship she hadn't recognized. The situation was even more heartbreaking because Jessica was actually doing everything right. She was trying to communicate openly about her concerns, giving Ryan space to process his feelings, and approaching their upcoming marriage with maturity and commitment. Ryan's crisis had nothing to do with Jessica's worthiness as a partner, and everything to do with his own emotional immaturity and unwillingness to do the hard work of building genuine intimacy. By Friday, I had convinced myself that the worst was over. Ryan seemed to have made his decision to proceed with the wedding, and while his emotional state was clearly compromised, at least he wasn't actively trying to involve me in his crisis anymore. I hoped that time and distance would help him work through his feelings and find a way to commit genuinely to Jessica. But Friday evening brought a phone call that changed everything and revealed just how naive I'd been about the true scope of the situation. The call came from Nicole Parker, Jessica's best friend and maid of honor, whom I'd met several times over the years but didn't know well personally. Nicole's voice was tense and worried as she explained that she was calling because she was concerned about Jessica and didn't know where else to turn. Nicole said that Jessica had confided in her about Ryan's strange behavior and her growing fears that something was seriously wrong with their relationship. Jessica was starting to panic about the wedding, wondering if Ryan's distance meant he was having second thoughts about marrying her. But that wasn't the most disturbing part of Nicole's call. She said that during the Bachelorette party weekend, Jessica had mentioned feeling like she was competing with someone for Ryan's attention, though she couldn't identify who or what was causing that feeling. Jessica had described sensing that Ryan's thoughts and emotions were focused elsewhere, that he seemed to be investing his energy in something or someone outside their relationship. Nicole had initially dismissed Jessica's concerns as normal pre-wedding anxiety, but Ryan's continued strange behavior throughout the week had made her reconsider. She was calling me because she hoped I might have insights into what was going on, since I was Jessica's sister, and might have noticed things that others had missed. The conversation was excruciating because Nicole was asking me to help solve a problem that I understood completely but couldn't explain without destroying my sister's life. I found myself in the impossible position of pretending ignorance, while someone who genuinely cared about Jessica begged me for help protecting her from a situation I knew was far worse than anyone imagined. I tried to give Nicole general advice about supporting Jessica through pre-wedding stress and encouraging open communication between the couple, but I could hear the frustration in her voice as she realized I wasn't providing the insights or solutions she'd hoped for. Before hanging up, Nicole said something that haunted me for days afterward. She mentioned that during one of their late-night conversations in Vail, Jessica had said she felt like
she was marrying someone who was in love with the idea of her rather than actually in love with her as a person. The observation was devastatingly accurate and showed that Jessica's intuition was picking up on the emotional distance that Ryan's feelings for me had created. She could sense that something was wrong with their connection, even though she didn't understand the specific cause. Knowing that Jessica was already questioning the authenticity of Ryan's love made his behavior even more cruel and destructive. Instead of addressing her concerns honestly or working to rebuild genuine intimacy, he was planning to marry her while maintaining emotional investment in someone else. After Nicole's call, I spent the weekend wrestling with the decision I'd been avoiding since Ryan's visit to Austin. I could no longer pretend that staying silent was protecting Jessica from unnecessary pain. She was already in pain, already questioning her relationship, already sensing that something fundamental was wrong with Ryan's commitment to her. The question was no longer whether Jessica would be hurt by the truth, but whether she would be hurt more by discovering it before the wedding or after. If I told her about Ryan's confession and our inappropriate communication, she would have the information she needed to make an informed decision about her future. If I continued to stay silent and she married Ryan without knowing about his crisis, she would spend years in a marriage with someone who had never fully committed to her. She would continue to sense his emotional distance without understanding its cause, probably blaming herself for problems that had nothing to do with her worthiness as a partner. The choice between immediate devastating truth and years of slow-burning deception seemed obvious when I framed it that way. Jessica deserved to know what kind of man she was about to marry and what kind of relationship she was entering. She deserved the chance to make her own decisions based on complete information, rather than proceeding with a marriage built on fundamental dishonesty. But making that intellectual decision and actually following through with it were two entirely different challenges. Telling Jessica the truth would require confessing months of secret communication with her fiancé, admitting that I'd been keeping crucial information from her for weeks, and potentially destroying our relationship forever. There was also the very real possibility that Jessica wouldn't believe me, or would blame me for Ryan's feelings. She might see my revelation as an attempt to sabotage her happiness out of jealousy or spite. She might choose to stay with Ryan anyway, and simply ban me from their lives to eliminate the source of temptation. Every possible outcome felt catastrophic, but continuing to enable Ryan's deception felt even worse. I had reached the point where my silence was actively harming Jessica, and I couldn't live with that knowledge anymore. Sunday night, exactly 1 week before the wedding, I made the decision that would change everything.
I bought a plane ticket to Denver and sent Jessica a text asking if we could meet privately on Monday evening. I told her I had something important to discuss about the wedding that couldn't wait any longer. Jessica's response was immediate and worried. She asked if everything was okay and whether my urgent request was related to the family tensions she'd been sensing lately. I assured her that everyone was healthy and safe, but that we needed to talk in person about something that could affect her future happiness. The conversation would be the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the most necessary. Jessica deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be to hear, or how devastating it might be to tell. Our relationship might not survive the revelation, but her marriage definitely wouldn't survive the foundation of deception that Ryan was asking her to build her life upon. As I prepared for the flight to Denver and the conversation that would either save my sister from a disastrous marriage or destroy our relationship forever, I realized that some truths are too important to keep hidden, no matter what the personal cost might be. The flight from Austin to Denver felt like the longest 3 hours of my life. I stared out the airplane window at the landscape passing below, rehearsing different versions of the conversation I was about to have with Jessica. No matter how I approached the topic, every possible opening felt inadequate for the magnitude of what I needed to reveal. I had booked a hotel room near the airport rather than staying with my parents, knowing that the conversation with Jessica needed to happen in a neutral space where we could both speak freely without worrying about family members overhearing. The weight of what I was about to do pressed down on my chest like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe normally. Jessica had suggested meeting at a quiet coffee shop in downtown Denver, a place we'd visited together during college when we needed to talk through serious topics away from family scrutiny. The location held memories of other difficult conversations we'd navigated successfully, and I hoped that history might help us get through this one as well. When I arrived at the coffee shop Monday evening, Jessica was already there, sitting in a corner booth with 2 steaming mugs in front of her. She'd ordered my usual lavender latte without being asked, a small gesture of sisterly consideration that made my heart ache with guilt about what I was about to put her through. Jessica looked beautiful but tired, wearing a soft blue sweater that brought out her eyes and minimal makeup that couldn't quite hide the stress lines that had appeared around her mouth over the past week. The closer the wedding got, the more anxious she seemed to become, and I knew that Ryan's strange behavior was taking a serious toll on her emotional state. She stood to hug me when I approached the table, and I held her a little longer than usual, knowing this might be the last time she embraced me with complete trust and affection. When we separated, I could see the worry in her eyes as she searched my face for clues about why I'd flown to Denver with less than 24 hours' notice. We made small talk for a few minutes about my flight and her final wedding preparations, but the forced casualness felt hollow and artificial. Jessica knew I hadn't traveled from Austin to discuss flower arrangements or seating charts, and I could see her growing impatience with my obvious stalling. Finally, she set down her coffee mug and looked at me directly with the kind of steady gaze that had always meant she was ready for complete honesty, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be. She asked me straight out what was going on, and why I seemed so nervous about whatever I needed to tell her. I took a deep breath and began with the hardest admission that I'd been keeping something important from her for months, something that directly affected her relationship with Ryan and her upcoming marriage. I told her that what I was about to share would probably change everything she thought she knew about her fiancé, and that I was only telling her now because I'd finally realized that my silence was hurting her more than the truth could. Jessica's expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as she processed my words. She asked if Ryan was cheating on her, if he was sick, if there was some kind of financial or legal problem I'd discovered. The questions came rapid fire, each one revealing a different fear she'd been harboring about why their relationship had felt so strained lately. I told her that Ryan wasn't cheating in the traditional sense, but that he had been having an emotional affair that threatened the foundation of their relationship. When she asked who the other woman was, I watched her face carefully as I said the words that would shatter her understanding of the past 2 years. "It's me, Jess. He thinks he's in love with me." The silence that followed felt endless. Jessica stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, cycling through disbelief, confusion, hurt, and something that looked almost like relief. She asked me to repeat what I'd just said, as if she couldn't quite process the information the first time. I explained everything: the months of increasingly personal text messages, Ryan's confession of feelings, his doubts about their relationship, and his late-night visit to my apartment the weekend of her bachelorette party. I told her about his inappropriate request to continue our friendship throughout their marriage and my repeated attempts to discourage his feelings and redirect him back to their relationship. As I spoke, Jessica's face went through a remarkable transformation. The initial shock gave way to a kind of grim understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve for months were finally clicking into place. She nodded slowly at certain details, her expression suggesting that my revelations were confirming suspicions she'd been afraid to acknowledge. When I finished my explanation, Jessica was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee as she processed everything I'd told her. When she finally looked up, her first question surprised me. She asked why I had waited so long to tell her, why I had let her continue planning a wedding to someone who was emotionally invested in another woman. The question stung because it was completely fair. I tried to explain my reasoning, my hope that Ryan would work through his feelings and recommit to her, my fear of causing unnecessary pain if the situation resolved itself, my concern about destroying family relationships over what might have been temporary confusion on Ryan's part. But as I spoke, I realized how selfish my motivations had actually been. I had prioritized my own comfort and my relationship with Jessica over her right to make informed decisions about her future. I had enabled Ryan's deception by staying silent, allowing him to continue planning a marriage he wasn't emotionally prepared for, while Jessica invested more deeply in a relationship that was fundamentally compromised. Jessica listened to my explanations without interrupting, but I could see the hurt in her eyes as she understood that I had chosen to protect myself rather than protect her. She said she felt betrayed by both Ryan and me, by Ryan for obvious reasons, and by me for allowing her to continue living in ignorance, while her fiancé was confessing his love for her sister. The conversation that followed was the most difficult we'd ever had. Jessica asked detailed questions about my relationship with Ryan, trying to understand how their situation had developed without her noticing. She wanted to know if I had ever encouraged his feelings, if I had been attracted to him, if there was any truth to his belief that we had a special connection. I answered as honestly as I could, acknowledging that I had enjoyed our conversations and found him easy to talk to, but emphasizing that I had never seen him as anything more than my sister's boyfriend. I explained that his feelings seemed to be based on a fantasy he'd constructed rather than any real emotional connection between us. Jessica seemed to find some comfort in my assurances that I had never reciprocated Ryan's feelings, but she was devastated by the realization that her fiancé had been emotionally unavailable throughout most of their relationship. She said she'd always sensed that he was holding something back, that there was a part of himself he wouldn't share with her, but she'd assumed it was normal male reticence rather than active investment in someone else. As we talked, Jessica revealed things about her relationship with Ryan that I'd never known. She said he had always been reluctant to discuss their future in concrete terms, changing the subject whenever she brought up plans for children, career goals, or long-term dreams. She'd attributed his vagueness to being a naturally private person, but now she wondered if he'd been avoiding those conversations because he wasn't sure he wanted a future with her. She also mentioned that their physical intimacy had declined significantly over the past year, which she'd blamed on wedding stress and busy schedules. Now she understood that Ryan's emotional distance had been affecting every aspect of their relationship, creating a barrier between them that she'd been unable to identify or address. The most heartbreaking part of our conversation was Jessica's admission that she'd been questioning their compatibility for months but had convinced herself that her doubts were cold feet rather than legitimate concerns. She said she'd been working overtime to be the perfect fiancé, hoping that if she could just be supportive and understanding enough, Ryan would become more emotionally available and enthusiastic about their future together. Learning that Ryan's distance was caused by feelings for me, rather than anything she had done wrong, seemed to provide Jessica with a mixture of relief and devastation. She was relieved to finally understand why their relationship had felt so hollow lately, but devastated to realize that no amount of effort on her part could have fixed the fundamental problem. As the evening progressed, Jessica's shock gave way to anger. She was furious with Ryan for his emotional dishonesty and his willingness to marry her while harboring feelings for someone else. She was angry with me for keeping his secret and allowing her to continue investing in a relationship that was already compromised. But mostly she was angry with herself for ignoring her instincts and pushing forward with a wedding that felt increasingly wrong. Jessica asked what I thought she should do, whether I believed Ryan could work through his feelings and become a committed husband, or whether she should call off the wedding entirely. I told her that I couldn't make that decision for her, but that I thought she deserved a partner who was completely certain about wanting to be with her. I shared my observation that Ryan's feelings for me seemed to be less about actual love and more about his fear of commitment and his tendency to idealize alternative lives, rather than working on his current reality. I suggested that his crisis might be a symptom of deeper issues with emotional maturity and relationship skills that would affect any marriage he entered. Jessica nodded thoughtfully at my analysis, saying it aligned with concerns she'd had about Ryan's character, but had been afraid to voice. She mentioned that he had a pattern of becoming dissatisfied with situations once they became routine or required sustained effort, always seeming to believe that something better was waiting for him elsewhere. The conversation continued late into the evening as Jessica processed the implications of everything I'd told her. She talked through her options, confronting Ryan and demanding complete honesty about his feelings, calling off the wedding and dealing with the social and financial consequences, or proceeding with the marriage while trying to work through the issues afterward. Each option carried significant risks and potential for pain, but Jessica seemed to be leaning toward confronting Ryan directly and making her decision based on his response. She said she couldn't marry someone without complete transparency about where they stood, regardless of how difficult that conversation might be. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Jessica asked me one final question that revealed the depth of her hurt. She wanted to know if I thought she was the kind of person who deserved to be someone's second choice, someone a man settled for because he couldn't have who he really wanted. The question broke my heart because it showed how deeply Ryan's emotional affair had damaged Jessica's self-worth. I told her absolutely and emphatically that she deserved to be someone's first choice, their priority, their greatest love. I said that any man who couldn't recognize her value and commit to her completely didn't deserve her, regardless of his reasons for uncertainty. We parted that night with our relationship fundamentally changed, but not destroyed. Jessica was hurt by my months of silence, but she understood why I had struggled with the decision to tell her. She was grateful to finally have answers about Ryan's behavior, even though those answers were painful to hear. Jessica promised to keep me informed about whatever decision she made regarding the wedding, and I promised to support her choice, regardless of what it was. We both acknowledged that the next few days would be difficult for everyone involved, but that getting to the truth was better than continuing to live with deception. The following morning, Jessica called Ryan and asked him to meet her at their apartment for an important conversation. She didn't give him any indication of what she wanted to discuss, but her tone apparently conveyed the seriousness of the situation because he immediately canceled his work meetings and came home. According to Jessica's account, which she shared with me later, Ryan's reaction to her confrontation was everything she'd feared and more. When she told him she knew about his feelings for me and his visit to Austin, he didn't deny the allegations or try to minimize their significance. Instead, he seemed almost relieved that the truth was finally out in the open. Ryan admitted that he'd been struggling with his feelings about their relationship for over a year, but he'd convinced himself that marriage would solve his doubts and help him commit more fully to their life together. He acknowledged that his emotional investment in me had been inappropriate and unfair to Jessica, but he also said he wasn't sure he could simply turn off those feelings on command. When Jessica asked if he wanted to call off the wedding, Ryan's response was devastating in its honesty. He said he didn't know what he wanted, that he was confused about his feelings and uncertain about his ability to be the husband she deserved. He asked if they could postpone the wedding while he worked through his issues, possibly with professional help. But Jessica had heard enough. She told Ryan that she couldn't marry someone who was uncertain about wanting to be with her, and that postponing the wedding would only prolong the pain for everyone involved. She said she needed a partner who was enthusiastic about building a life with her, not someone who saw marriage as a way to work through his confusion about other women. The breakup, when it finally happened, was surprisingly civil. Ryan acknowledged that Jessica was making the right decision and apologized for putting her through months of emotional uncertainty. He agreed to handle the logistics of canceling the wedding and dealing with vendors, guests, and family members. Jessica called me Wednesday afternoon to tell me that the wedding was officially off. Her voice was steady but exhausted, as she explained that she felt relieved despite the pain and embarrassment of calling off a wedding less than a week before the ceremony. She said she'd rather deal with temporary humiliation than commit to a lifetime of wondering if her husband really wanted to be with her. The family reactions were as dramatic as expected. My parents were devastated by the sudden cancellation and demanded explanations that Jessica wasn't ready to provide. She told them simply that she and Ryan had realized they weren't compatible and had decided to end their engagement rather than proceed with a marriage that felt wrong. Ryan apparently told his family a similar story, taking responsibility for the breakup without revealing the specific details about his feelings for me. Both families were confused and disappointed, but they seemed to accept that sometimes relationships end even when everything appears to be perfect from the outside. The most difficult conversation was with Nicole and Jessica's other close friends, who had invested significant time and money in celebrating her upcoming marriage. Jessica decided to tell them a more complete version of the truth, explaining that Ryan had developed feelings for someone else, and that she decided she couldn't marry someone whose heart wasn't fully committed to their relationship. Her friends rallied around her with impressive loyalty and support, helping her return wedding gifts, cancel reservations, and notify guests about the cancellation. Several of them mentioned that they'd sensed something was off about Ryan's behavior during the Bachelorette party weekend, but they'd attributed his distance to normal pre-wedding nerves. The week that followed was emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. Jessica moved out of the apartment she'd shared with Ryan and temporarily stayed with our parents while she figured out her next steps. She took time off work to process the breakup and deal with the practical aspects of untangling a relationship that had been moving toward permanent commitment. I extended my stay in Denver to be available for Jessica during this difficult time, working remotely while providing whatever emotional support she needed. Our relationship was still fragile from the months of secrecy I'd maintained, but Jessica seemed to appreciate having someone who understood the full complexity of what she was going through. About 2 weeks after the wedding cancellation, Jessica and I had a follow-up conversation that helped establish the new foundation of our relationship. She told me that while she was still hurt by my decision to keep Ryan's confession secret for so long, she understood that I'd been trying to protect her from unnecessary pain. More importantly, Jessica said she was grateful that I'd finally found the courage to tell her the truth, even though it meant destroying the life she'd thought she was building. She acknowledged that proceeding with the marriage, while Ryan harbored feelings for me, would have been a disaster for everyone involved. Jessica also revealed that the breakup had forced her to confront other issues in her life that she'd been avoiding. She said she'd been so focused on meeting family expectations and building a conventional life that she'd stopped paying attention to her own needs and desires. The failed engagement was devastatingly painful, but it had also given her permission to reconsider what she actually wanted from life and relationships. 6 months later, Jessica made a decision that surprised everyone. She left the family business to pursue a master's degree in social work. She said she'd always been drawn to helping people in crisis, but she'd never considered it a viable career option because our parents had emphasized financial security over personal fulfillment. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that Jessica was now following a path similar to the one I'd taken years earlier, choosing personal authenticity over family expectations. The difference was that she had the benefit of watching my journey and understanding that it was possible to maintain family relationships while pursuing unconventional dreams. Our parents were initially concerned about Jessica's career change, just as they'd been worried about my decision to pursue graphic design. But they'd learned from their experience with me that attempting to control their daughter's choices only created distance and resentment. They offered their support for Jessica's new direction, even though they didn't fully understand her motivations. As for Ryan, he seemed to disappear from our social circles after the breakup. Jessica heard through mutual friends that he'd moved to Oregon to pursue the environmental science program he'd mentioned to me months earlier. Apparently, the end of their engagement had given him the push he needed to make major changes in his life and pursue work that felt more meaningful to him. I never heard from Ryan again after blocking his number, which was exactly what I'd hoped would happen. His crisis had been a catalyst for important revelations and changes in our family, but his personal journey toward emotional maturity wasn't something I wanted to be involved in. Looking back on the entire situation, I realized that everyone involved learned valuable lessons about honesty, authenticity, and the importance of addressing problems directly rather than hoping they'll resolve themselves. Jessica learned to trust her instincts about relationships and to prioritize her own needs rather than simply meeting other people's expectations. I learned that keeping secrets to protect people often causes more harm than telling difficult truths. My months of silence hadn't protected Jessica from pain, they just delayed that pain, while allowing her to invest more deeply in a relationship that was fundamentally flawed. Our family learned that supporting each other sometimes means accepting choices we don't understand or approve of. Both Jessica and I had to forge our own paths, rather than following the scripts our parents had written for us, and that process required courage from everyone involved. Most importantly, we all learned that authentic relationships require complete honesty, even when that honesty is uncomfortable or inconvenient. Ryan's inability to be truthful about his doubts and feelings had created a crisis that affected multiple families and forced several people to make major life changes. Today, Jessica is thriving in her social work program and has started dating someone who shares her passion for helping others. She seems happier and more confident than I'd seen her in years, as if the painful experience with Ryan helped her understand what she actually wanted from life and relationships. Our relationship as sisters has been strengthened by surviving such a difficult situation together. We're more honest with each other now, more willing to address problems directly, rather than hoping they'll disappear on their own. The trust we rebuilt after my months of secrecy feels more solid than what we'd had before, based on a deeper understanding of each other's values and priorities. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd told Jessica about Ryan's feelings immediately after his first inappropriate message, or if I'd refused to engage with his emotional crisis from the beginning. Would their relationship have ended sooner with less pain for everyone involved? Would Ryan have been forced to confront his commitment issues before they became a crisis that affected multiple families? But I've learned that regret about past decisions is less useful than applying those lessons to future situations. The important thing is that Jessica now has the information she needs to build authentic relationships based on mutual respect and genuine commitment. She knows what red flags to watch for and how to trust her instincts when something feels wrong. As for me, I've returned to Austin with a deeper appreciation for the life I've built here, and the relationships I've formed with people who value honesty and authenticity. The crisis with Ryan and Jessica reminded me how important it is to maintain clear boundaries and address problems directly, rather than hoping they'll resolve themselves. The experience also reinforced my belief that following your own path, even when it disappoints others, is better than living a life that feels false or unfulfilling. Both Jessica and I had to learn this lesson in our own ways, but we both emerged stronger and more self-aware from the process. Our story isn't unique. Many families struggle with expectations versus authenticity, with secrets that are kept to protect people, but end up causing more harm than good. The key is learning to value truth over comfort, to address problems when they're small, rather than waiting for them to become crises, and to support each other's growth, even when it takes unexpected directions. The canceled wedding was painful for everyone involved, but it ultimately led to better outcomes than a marriage built on deception and divided loyalty would have produced. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is tell them a truth they don't want to hear, even when that truth has the potential to change everything they thought they knew about their life. The morning of what should have been Jessica's wedding day arrived with unseasonable warmth for late September in Colorado. I woke up in my hotel room to golden sunlight streaming through the windows and the distant sound of church bells ringing across Denver. For a moment I forgot why I was there, and my first thought was wondering if Jessica was nervous about walking down the aisle in a few hours. Then reality crashed back, and I remembered that there would be no wedding, no ceremony, no celebration of love and commitment. Instead, Jessica was probably waking up in our childhood bedroom, facing the first day of rebuilding her life, after discovering that the man she'd planned to marry had been emotionally involved with her sister for months. I had been in Denver for nearly 2 weeks now, extending my original 3-day trip to provide support during the aftermath of the
Wedding cancellation. What I hadn't expected was how much the experience would change my own perspective on family, relationships, and the complex ways that secrets can both protect and destroy the people we love most. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica asking if I wanted to meet for breakfast before I flew back to Austin later that day. She suggested a small diner we'd discovered during our teenage years, a place that served enormous pancakes and had booths private enough for serious conversations. The location felt appropriate for what would likely be our final processing session before I returned to my regular life. When I arrived at the diner, Jessica was already seated in our usual corner booth, looking remarkably composed for someone whose life had been completely upended 2 weeks earlier. She wore jeans and a soft green sweater that brought out her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look younger and more relaxed than she'd appeared in months. The most striking thing about Jessica's appearance was her expression. Instead of the devastated, hollow look I'd expected to see on someone whose wedding had just been canceled, she seemed almost peaceful. There was still sadness in her eyes, but underneath it was something that looked remarkably like relief. We ordered coffee and the massive blueberry pancakes we'd shared countless times during our teenage years, when this diner had been our refuge for discussing everything from college applications to boy troubles. The familiar ritual felt comforting and appropriate for what we both knew would be an important conversation about our relationship and the future. Jessica began by thanking me for staying in Denver longer than planned and for being available during what she called the most difficult 2 weeks of her adult life. She said that having someone who understood the full complexity of the situation had been invaluable, even though our relationship was still healing from the months of secrecy that had preceded the revelation. She then said something that surprised me completely. Jessica told me that as painful as the wedding cancellation had been, she was beginning to realize that it might have been the best thing that could have happened to her. She said the experience had forced her to examine not just her relationship with Ryan, but her entire approach to life and decision-making. Jessica explained that she'd spent the past 2 weeks thinking about how she'd ended up engaged to someone who was fundamentally incompatible with her, and she'd realized that she'd been making choices based on what other people expected rather than what felt right to her personally. She said she'd been so focused on achieving conventional milestones like marriage and family that she'd stopped paying attention to whether those milestones aligned with her actual desires and values. The engagement to Ryan, she admitted, had always felt slightly off, but she'd convinced herself that the discomfort was normal pre-commitment anxiety rather than a legitimate warning sign. She'd been so invested in the idea of being married and moving to the next expected life stage that she'd ignored her instincts about Ryan's emotional availability and their fundamental compatibility. Jessica said that discovering Ryan's feelings for me had initially felt like a personal rejection, as if she wasn't interesting or attractive enough to hold her fiancé's attention. But as she'd processed the situation with the help of a therapist she'd started seeing, she'd begun to understand that Ryan's crisis had nothing to do with her worthiness and everything to do with his own emotional immaturity and fear of commitment. More importantly, Jessica had realized that she'd been settling for a relationship that didn't truly fulfill her because she was afraid of being alone or disappointing family expectations. She said that Ryan's emotional distance, which she'd always attributed to his personality, had actually been a red flag that she'd chosen to ignore because addressing it would have required difficult conversations and possibly ending a relationship that looked perfect from the outside. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Jessica told me that she'd spent considerable time over the past 2 weeks thinking about my decision to move to Austin and pursue graphic design despite family opposition. She said she'd always admired my courage in choosing authenticity over approval, but she'd also secretly judged me for causing family tension and disrupting the harmony our parents valued so highly. Now, Jessica said, she understood that my choice to follow my own path hadn't been selfish or rebellious, but necessary for my long-term happiness and emotional health. She realized that I'd been modeling something important about the difference between living for other people's expectations and living according to your own values and interests. Jessica's newfound appreciation for unconventional choices had led her to reconsider her own career path and life goals. She told me that she'd always been interested in social work and helping people in crisis, but she'd dismissed those interests as impractical because our parents had emphasized financial security and professional prestige above personal fulfillment. The decision to leave the family business and pursue a master's degree in social work had felt terrifying at first, Jessica admitted, because it meant disappointing our parents' expectations yet again. But she'd realized that staying in a career that didn't inspire her would be a form of slow spiritual death, just like staying in a marriage with someone who wasn't fully committed to her would have been. Our parents' reaction to Jessica's career change had been surprisingly supportive, she told me. While they'd initially expressed concern about her leaving a stable, lucrative position to pursue graduate school in a field they didn't fully understand, they'd ultimately said they wanted her to be happy more than they wanted her to meet their expectations. Jessica suspected that our parents had learned from their experience with my career choice that attempting to control their adult daughter's decisions only created distance and resentment. They'd seen how much happier and more fulfilled I'd become after moving to Austin and building a successful design career, and they'd apparently decided that supporting their children's authentic choices was more important than enforcing their own vision of success. The conversation shifted to our relationship as sisters and how the crisis with Ryan had both damaged and ultimately strengthened our bond. Jessica acknowledged that she'd been hurt by my months of silence about Ryan's inappropriate behavior, but she'd come to understand that I'd been trying to protect her from unnecessary pain while hoping the situation would resolve itself. She said that my decision to finally tell her the truth, despite the personal cost and potential damage to our relationship, had demonstrated a level of courage and loyalty that she deeply respected.
Jessica admitted that she might not have been brave enough to share such devastating information if our positions had been reversed, and she was grateful that I'd ultimately prioritized her well-being over my own comfort. More importantly, Jessica said, the experience had taught both of us the importance of complete honesty in close relationships, even when that honesty was uncomfortable or inconvenient. She said she never wanted either of us to carry such significant secrets again, and she hoped we could commit to addressing problems directly rather than hoping they would disappear on their own. I told Jessica that the experience had changed my understanding of what it meant to be a protective older sister. I'd thought I was shielding her from pain by staying silent about Ryan's confession, but I'd actually been enabling his deception and denying her the agency to make informed decisions about her own life. I admitted that part of my motivation for keeping quiet had been selfish, driven by my fear of being blamed for Ryan's feelings or losing my relationship with Jessica entirely. I'd learned that trying to control outcomes through secrecy usually backfires, creating larger problems than the ones you're trying to avoid. The crisis had also taught me valuable lessons about boundaries and emotional responsibility. I realized that I'd been too available to Ryan as a confidant and emotional support system, inadvertently enabling his avoidance of genuine intimacy with Jessica. In the future, I would be more careful about maintaining appropriate relationships with my siblings' romantic partners. As our conversation continued, Jessica shared details about her new relationship with someone she'd met in her graduate program orientation. She said that dating someone who shared her passion for helping others felt completely different from her relationship with Ryan, more natural and effortless in ways that made her understand what genuine compatibility actually felt like. The new relationship was still in early stages, Jessica emphasized, but she was approaching it with much more self-awareness and clarity about what she needed from a partner. She said she was no longer willing to ignore red flags or make excuses for someone's emotional unavailability, and she was committed to building relationships based on mutual respect and genuine enthusiasm rather than convenience or social expectations. Jessica also told me about the friendships she'd deepened during her crisis period. Nicole and her other close friends had rallied around her with impressive loyalty and support, helping her navigate the practical and emotional challenges of calling off a wedding and starting over. She said the experience had shown her the value of surrounding herself with people who prioritized her happiness over social conventions. Several of Jessica's friends had privately admitted that they'd been concerned about Ryan's behavior during the Bachelorette party weekend but hadn't known how to express their worries without seeming unsupportive. They'd noticed his emotional distance and apparent preoccupation with something outside the celebration, but they'd attributed it to normal pre-wedding anxiety rather than a deeper problem. The revelation about Ryan's feelings for me had actually made sense to Jessica's friends, who'd been puzzled by his behavior throughout the engagement period. They'd observed that he seemed more interested in talking about me and my career than in discussing his future with Jessica, but they'd interpreted this as normal interest in his future sister-in-law rather than romantic fascination. Looking back, Jessica said, there had been numerous warning signs about Ryan's emotional availability and commitment that she'd either missed or deliberately ignored. He'd been reluctant to make concrete plans for their future together, vague about his career goals and life priorities, and increasingly distant as their wedding date approached. The most telling sign, Jessica realized in hindsight, had been Ryan's reaction to her own career success and growing confidence. Instead of celebrating her achievements at the family business or supporting her professional development, he'd seemed threatened by her competence and independence. She suspected now that his feelings for me had been partly driven by his perception that I was less threatening to his ego because I wasn't directly involved in his daily life. Jessica's newfound clarity about relationship dynamics and warning signs made her optimistic about her ability to build healthier partnerships in the future. She said she felt like the painful experience with Ryan had been a necessary education about the difference between settling for someone who looked good on paper and finding someone who was genuinely excited about building a life with her. Our conversation eventually turned to our parents and how the wedding cancellation had affected the broader family dynamics. Jessica said that Mom and Dad had been primarily concerned with her emotional well-being, rather than the social embarrassment or financial cost of the canceled celebration. They'd apparently matured significantly in their approach to supporting their daughters through difficult situations. The crisis had also brought our family closer together in unexpected ways. Our parents had seen how Jessica and I supported each other through the aftermath of the revelation, and they'd expressed pride in the relationship we'd built as adult sisters. They'd said they were grateful that we trusted each other enough to share difficult truths and work through complex problems together. Jessica mentioned that our parents had also gained new appreciation for the importance of emotional intelligence and authentic communication in relationships. They'd been impressed by Jessica's maturity in handling the breakup and her decision to prioritize her long-term happiness over short-term social convenience. The experience had apparently caused our parents to reflect on their own marriage and the ways they'd modeled relationships for their daughters. They'd acknowledged that their emphasis on conventional success and social respectability might have sent unintended messages about the importance of appearances over authentic connection. As our breakfast conversation drew to a close, Jessica asked about my plans for returning to Austin and whether I was looking forward to getting back to my normal routine. I told her that I was eager to return to my work and the life I'd built in Texas, but that I was also grateful for the extended time we'd spent together processing such a significant family crisis. The weeks in Denver had reminded me how much I valued my relationship with Jessica and how important it was to maintain close family connections despite geographical distance. I'd realized that my move to Austin didn't have to mean emotional distance from my family, and that we could build strong adult relationships based on mutual respect and honest communication. Jessica said she was planning to visit me in Austin once her graduate program schedule allowed, and she expressed genuine interest in seeing the life I'd built there. She wanted to meet my friends, see my work environment, and understand better how I'd created a successful career in a field our parents had initially considered impractical. The prospect of showing Jessica my Austin life felt exciting and meaningful in ways I hadn't expected. For years, our family visits had been somewhat tense affairs where I felt like I had to justify my choices or defend my lifestyle. Now Jessica seemed genuinely curious about my experiences and supportive of my unconventional path. As we prepared to leave the diner, Jessica made a comment that perfectly encapsulated how much our relationship had evolved through the crisis. She said that she'd always seen me as the rebellious sister who caused family tension, but now she understood that I was actually the brave sister who'd shown everyone that it was possible to choose authenticity over approval and still maintain loving family relationships. The observation meant more to me than I could express. For years, I'd carried guilt about disappointing our parents and potentially setting a bad example for Jessica by pursuing a career they didn't understand. Learning that Jessica now saw my choices as courageous rather than selfish felt like a profound validation of the difficult path I'd chosen. Jessica also told me that watching me build a successful, fulfilling life in Austin had given her hope during her darkest moments after the wedding cancellation. She said that seeing someone she loved thrive after making difficult but authentic choices had helped her believe that she could rebuild her own life according to her true values and interests. The drive to the airport felt bittersweet as I prepared to return to Austin after 2 weeks of intense family bonding and emotional processing. I was ready to get back to my normal routine and the career I loved, but I was also reluctant to leave Jessica as she continued navigating the early stages of rebuilding her life. At the departure gate, Jessica and I hugged goodbye with an emotional intensity that surprised both of us. The hug felt like a seal on the new relationship we'd forged through crisis, one based on complete honesty and mutual respect rather than childhood roles and family expectations. Jessica whispered that she was proud of me for having the courage to tell her the truth about Ryan, even though it meant risking our relationship and causing immediate pain. She said that my willingness to prioritize her well-being over my own comfort had shown her what true sisterly love looked like. I told Jessica that I was proud of her strength in handling such a devastating betrayal with grace and wisdom, and for having the courage to start over rather than settling for a life that didn't truly fulfill her. I said that watching her navigate the crisis had deepened my respect for her character and resilience. The flight back to Austin gave me time to reflect on everything that had happened over the past few weeks and how the experience had changed my understanding of family loyalty, personal authenticity, and the complex ways that love sometimes requires difficult choices. I realized that the crisis with Ryan and Jessica had taught me that protecting people from truth often causes more harm than exposing them to difficult realities. My months of silence about Ryan's inappropriate behavior had been motivated by love and concern for Jessica, but they'd actually enabled deception and delayed necessary revelations. The experience had also reinforced my belief in the importance of following your authentic path, even when that path disappoints others or requires difficult conversations. Both Jessica and I had ultimately been happier when we chose to honor our true values and interests rather than conforming to external expectations. Most importantly, I'd learned that genuine family relationships can survive and even be strengthened by crisis, as long as everyone involved commits to honesty, mutual respect, and supporting each other's growth rather than trying to control each other's choices. Returning to my apartment in Austin felt like coming home to myself after weeks of intense emotional processing and family drama. My design studio looked exactly as I'd left it, with projects in various stages of completion and inspiration boards covered with color palettes and typography samples. The familiar creative chaos felt comforting and grounding after the interpersonal complexity I'd been navigating. Over the following weeks, I threw myself back into my work with renewed energy and appreciation for the life I'd built in Texas. The crisis with Jessica and Ryan had reminded me how much I valued the independence and authentic relationships I'd cultivated away from family expectations and childhood dynamics. Jessica and I maintained regular contact as she adjusted to her new reality and began her graduate program. Our conversations were deeper and more honest than they'd ever been, covering everything from her academic experiences to her evolving understanding of what she wanted from future relationships. She told me about the therapy sessions that were helping her process not just the betrayal by Ryan, but also the broader patterns of people-pleasing and approval-seeking that had shaped many of her life choices. The breakup had apparently catalyzed a much larger process of self-discovery and personal growth. Jessica also shared updates about Ryan, whom she occasionally heard about through mutual friends. He'd apparently moved to Oregon as planned and was pursuing environmental science studies while working part-time for a conservation organization. From what she could gather, he seemed to be finding more fulfillment in work that aligned with his values, but she had no interest in direct contact or detailed information about his life. Several months after the wedding cancellation, Jessica sent me a photo from her social work fieldwork placement at a crisis intervention center. She looked genuinely happy and engaged in ways I hadn't seen during her years at the family business. The work clearly suited her natural empathy and problem-solving abilities, and she was apparently excelling in her graduate program. The most significant development in Jessica's life was her growing relationship with David, a fellow social work student she'd met during orientation. Their connection had developed slowly and naturally through shared classes and volunteer work, based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect rather than external pressures or timelines. From Jessica's descriptions, David sounded like everything Ryan hadn't been emotionally available, enthusiastic about her goals and interests, and completely committed to building an authentic partnership with her. Their relationship was progressing at a healthy pace, with both of them prioritizing honest communication and mutual support. Jessica's happiness in her new relationship reinforced my belief that the canceled wedding had ultimately been a blessing rather than a tragedy. If she'd married Ryan while he harbored feelings for me, she would have spent years wondering why her husband seemed emotionally distant and uncommitted. Instead, she'd found someone who was genuinely excited about sharing his life with her. The family business had apparently thrived under new leadership after Jessica's departure. Our parents had hired an experienced real estate professional to take over Jessica's responsibilities, and they'd discovered that their daughter's career changes had forced them to become more strategic and professional in their business operations. More importantly, our parents seemed to have gained new respect for the courage required to make authentic life choices, even when those choices disappointed others or disrupted established plans. They'd seen how much happier both Jessica and I had become when we prioritized personal fulfillment over external expectations. A year after the wedding cancellation, Jessica visited me in Austin for the first time since I'd moved there. Showing her my life in Texas felt like a celebration of how far we'd both come in understanding and supporting each other's authentic choices. Jessica was impressed by the design work I was producing and the professional relationships I'd built in Austin's creative community. She said she finally understood why I'd been so determined to pursue graphic design despite family opposition, and she apologized for not supporting my choice more enthusiastically at the time. During her visit, Jessica met several of my friends and colleagues, who were charmed by her warmth and intelligence. Many of them commented afterward that they could see the family resemblance not just in our appearance, but in our shared values around authenticity and personal growth. The visit culminated in a conversation that felt like the final healing of the wounds created by the crisis with Ryan. Jessica told me that she was grateful for everything that had happened, painful as it had been at the time, because it had led her to a much more authentic and fulfilling life than she would have had if she'd married Ryan. She said that the experience had taught her to trust her instincts about relationships, to prioritize emotional compatibility over conventional timelines, and to value honesty over comfort in all her important relationships. Most importantly, it had shown her the difference between settling for someone who looked good on paper and finding someone who was genuinely excited about building a life with her. I told Jessica that watching her navigate such a difficult situation with wisdom and grace had deepened my respect for her character and strength. The crisis had revealed qualities in her that I'd never fully appreciated: her resilience, her commitment to personal growth, and her ability to learn from painful experiences rather than being broken by them. Looking back on the entire experience now, I understand that families sometimes have to go through crisis to reach deeper levels of authenticity and connection. The situation with Ryan forced all of us to examine our assumptions about relationships, success, and the difference between loving someone and trying to control their choices. Jessica's canceled wedding became a catalyst for positive changes that affected our entire family. Her discovery of meaningful work that aligned with her values, my deeper appreciation for the life I'd built in Austin, and our parents' evolution toward supporting their daughter's authentic choices rather than trying to enforce their own vision of success. Most importantly, Jessica and I developed a relationship based on complete honesty and mutual respect, free from the childhood dynamics and family expectations that had sometimes created distance between us. We learned that real love sometimes requires telling difficult truths and supporting each other's growth, even when it leads in unexpected directions. The experience taught me that protecting people from reality often causes more harm than exposing them to difficult truths, and that authentic relationships can only be built on a foundation of complete honesty and mutual respect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is tell them something they don't want to hear, especially when that truth gives them the information they need to make better choices about their life. Jessica's story became a reminder that it's never too late to choose authenticity over convenience, personal fulfillment over social expectations, and genuine love over relationships that merely look good from the outside. The canceled wedding was painful for everyone involved, but it ultimately led to better outcomes than a marriage built on deception and divided loyalty ever could have produced. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.